It started on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen. I was walking through the bustling streets of downtown, weaving through crowds of hurried people when I spotted him, a man standing completely still in the chaos as if time had paused just for him. He didn't look extraordinary. His clothes were plain, his posture relaxed, and his face carried an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between knowing and amused. But what struck me was his eyes, sharp, almost unnervingly so, as if he could see something others couldn't. As I passed him, our eyes met and he smiled faintly. Before I could look away, he called out, "You're going to want to remember this moment." I froze mid-step, unsure if he was talking to me or someone else. "Excuse me," I said, turning back. He took a step closer, his smile widening. "This moment," he repeated. "It's the one you'll look back on when everything changes." I felt a mix of curiosity and unease. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said, attempting a nervous laugh. "No," he replied, his tone firm but calm. "You're exactly who I mean. You'll understand soon enough." And with that he walked away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, his words echoing in my mind. I wanted to dismiss it as some odd encounter with a stranger, but something about the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, left me rattled. I didn't know it then, but he was right. That moment was the beginning of everything. For the rest of the afternoon I couldn't shake the stranger's words. "You're going to want to remember this moment." His certainty had been unnerving, and the way he disappeared so quickly left me with more questions than answers. Was he some kind of eccentric? A con artist? Or worse, someone playing an elaborate prank? But the strangest part wasn't what he said, it was how it made me feel. I didn't believe in fate or destiny, but something about the encounter felt significant. Like a thread had been tugged loose in the fabric of my otherwise predictable life, and I couldn't stop pulling on it. By the time I got home, I had replayed the moment at least a dozen times in my head. My roommate, Emily, immediately noticed my distracted mood. "What's with you?" she asked, plopping down on the couch with a bowl of popcorn. I hesitated, then told her about the man and what he'd said. Her reaction was predictably skeptical. "Sounds like a weirdo," she said with a shrug. "Why let it bother you?" "I don't know," I admitted, pacing the room. "It's just the way he said it. He wasn't joking. He looked at me like he knew something." Emily rolled her eyes. "Let me guess, he also offered to read your palm or sell you a magic crystal?" I laughed despite myself, but the unease lingered. "I know it sounds crazy," I said, sinking into the chair across from her. "But I can't stop thinking about it." "Then don't," she said, tossing a kernel of popcorn into her mouth. "Sometimes weird stuff happens. Maybe it'll make a great story later." Her words were meant to dismiss the whole thing, but they only added to the weight of it. A great story? Maybe. Or maybe it was something more. The truth was, my life wasn't exactly full of moments worth remembering. I worked a decent but uninspiring job as a junior editor for a local magazine. Most of my days were spent chasing down last-minute content changes or fixing poorly written copy. It wasn't what I had dreamed of doing when I moved to the city, but it paid the bills and kept my parents from asking too many questions about my career trajectory. Outside of work, things weren't much more exciting. My social life consisted of occasional happy hours with coworkers and lazy nights binge-watching TV with Emily. It wasn't a bad life by any means, but it was small, predictable, safe. That's probably why the stranger's words hit me so hard. When everything changes, change wasn't something I actively sought. It was something I avoided, clinging to routine like a lifeboat in the chaos of adulthood. And yet, there I was, wondering if a single encounter with a mysterious man could somehow be the spark that set my carefully constructed life on fire. The next day I couldn't focus at work. Every email I typed felt like a blur, and I caught myself staring out the window more than once, my mind drifting back to the man on the street. I even Googled phrases like stranger predicting future and cryptic encounters meaning. The results were about as helpful as you'd expect. A mix of clickbait articles, pseudoscience, and conspiracy theories that only made me feel more ridiculous. But something kept gnawing at me. I couldn't just let it go. That evening as I walked home, I found myself scanning the crowd, half hoping I might see him again. I knew it was a long shot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter wasn't over. It wasn't until the following week that things took an even stranger turn. I was heading to the subway after work, my bag weighed down with unfinished edits, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Taped to the side of a lamppost was a small piece of paper, fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. At first I thought it was just another flyer or a lost pet notice, but something about it caught my attention. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and strangely familiar. I stepped closer, squinting to read the words. "You're closer than you think." A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the words, it was the handwriting. I was almost certain it matched the man's from our brief encounter. My mind raced as I looked around, scanning the faces in the crowd, but he was nowhere to be seen. Was this a coincidence? Or had he left this note here intentionally, knowing I would find it? The logical part of me wanted to dismiss the idea as ridiculous, but deep down I felt an undeniable pull. The note was meant for me. It had to be. I pulled the paper off the lamppost and slipped it into my bag, my hands trembling slightly. The subway ride home felt surreal, the world around me fading into the background as my mind replayed the encounter and the note over and over. When I got home, Emily was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Not quite," I replied, pulling the note from my bag and handing it to her. "But tell me this isn't weird." She read the words, her expression shifting from curiosity to mild alarm. "Okay, I'll admit it's creepy," she said, setting the note down on the counter. "But it doesn't mean it's from him. People leave random stuff like this all the time." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. "But what if it is?" Emily sighed. "If it is, then what? Are you supposed to follow some breadcrumb trail he's leaving? What if this guy's just messing with you?" I didn't have an answer, but her words planted a seed of doubt. Was I chasing something meaningful, or was I just being naive? That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the note on my nightstand. "You're closer than you think." Closer to what? And why did I feel like this was only the beginning? The next morning, I woke up feeling restless, my thoughts still tangled around the note. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a random coincidence, that somehow it was meant for me. But Emily's words echoed in my mind. What if this guy's just messing with you? By lunchtime, curiosity had won out. I decided to retrace my steps from the previous evening, hoping to find more clues, or at least some reassurance that I wasn't imagining things. The lamppost where I had found the note was empty, but I searched the nearby area, scanning benches, walls, and even trash cans for anything unusual. I was about to give up when something caught my eye. On the corner of a nearby cafe window was another piece of paper, taped at an angle as if placed in a hurry. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Look where it all began." The words hit me like a jolt. Where it all began. Was he referring to the moment we first met? The street corner where he had told me, "You're going to want to remember this moment"? It felt too deliberate to ignore. I pulled out my phone and mapped the quickest route back to that spot. The streets were busier than usual, and I found myself weaving through the crowd with a growing sense of urgency. When I finally arrived, I stood on the exact corner where I had first seen him. Nothing seemed out of place, just the usual chaos of city life. But then, as I scanned the area, I noticed a small alleyway I had never paid attention to before. At the entrance was another note, taped to a street lamp and fluttering slightly in the breeze. My pulse quickened as I approached it, the words coming into focus. "You're almost there." I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. The alley was quiet and narrow, with graffiti scrawled across the brick walls and a faint smell of damp concrete. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't turn back now. Stepping into the alley, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease. The noise of the bustling city faded behind me, replaced by the quiet hum of distant traffic and the faint drip of water from a nearby gutter. The alley seemed longer than it looked, each step feeling heavier as I moved deeper into the narrow space. Halfway down, I spotted another note, this one tucked into the edge of a cracked window ledge. My hands trembled as I pulled it free, the paper slightly damp but the words still legible. "What are you willing to risk to find the truth?" I froze, the question hitting me like a brick. What truth? And what risk? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. For a moment I considered turning back. Was this some elaborate joke, or was I walking into something I wasn't prepared for? But then I thought of the man's certainty, the way he had spoken to me like he knew something I didn't. If there was even a chance that this trail of notes could lead to answers, I had to keep going. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my bag before continuing down the alley. At the end of the path, the alley opened into a small courtyard I had never seen before. It was quiet and unassuming, with ivy climbing up the brick walls and a single bench sitting beneath a flickering street lamp. On the bench was a folded piece of paper weighted down by a smooth stone. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I picked up the note, I half expected someone to step out of the shadows or call my name. But the courtyard remained silent, and I was alone with the words written in that familiar handwriting. Now the real journey begins. I sank onto the bench, staring at the note as 1,000 questions flooded my mind. What journey? What was I being led to, and why me? I glanced around, searching for any sign of the man or anyone who might be watching, but the courtyard remained eerily still. For the first time, doubt began to creep in. Was I chasing a ghost, or was there something real waiting for me on the other side of this mystery? Either way, I couldn't stop now. Not when I was so close, whatever that meant. The next note had no instructions, only a set of coordinates scribbled in bold, precise handwriting. I stared at the numbers, my phone trembling slightly as I typed them into a map app. The location wasn't far, just a few blocks away in a part of the city I rarely visited. But the mystery deepened. Why lead me there? What was I supposed to find? As I made my way to the coordinates, the air seemed to thicken around me. Every sound, footsteps, distant conversations, the hum of passing cars, felt amplified. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see the man watching me from the crowd. But no one seemed out of place. When I reached the location, I stopped short. It was an old library, its stone facade weathered and imposing. The entrance was flanked by 2 massive oak doors, and above them an inscription read, "Knowledge reveals all truths." The words sent a shiver down my spine, almost as if they were speaking directly to me. Inside, the library was quiet, its towering shelves casting long shadows in the dim light. I approached the front desk, where an older woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose looked up from her book. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distracted. "I'm, looking for something," I said awkwardly, realizing how absurd I sounded. "Do you have anything under this?" I handed her the note with the coordinates, hoping she might recognize them. She studied the paper for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You'll want the reading room. 2nd floor, far end on the left. There's a private collection there. The key is already waiting." My heart raced as I followed her instructions, climbing the creaking staircase to the 2nd floor. The library seemed to grow quieter with every step, the air heavy with the scent of aged paper and dust. When I reached the door she mentioned, I found a small brass key hanging from a hook beside it. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the key. Was I really about to step into the unknown, guided only by a trail of cryptic notes and a stranger's words? Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room lined with shelves filled with old leather-bound books. A single desk sat in the center of the room, illuminated by a warm, golden desk lamp. On the desk was a single object, a sealed envelope with my name written on it in the same familiar handwriting. I froze in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just a trail of notes anymore. It was personal. Someone, knew who I was, and they had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure I ended up here. The weight of it all pressed down on me as I stepped inside and approached the desk. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, the paper thick and luxurious. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a neatly folded piece of paper inside. Written on it was a single sentence. "The truth you seek lies in your past." I stared at the words, my mind racing. My past? What did that mean? My childhood had been ordinary as far as I could remember. There were no dark secrets, no life-altering events that would justify the mystery unfolding around me. Or so I thought. Beneath the note was a small photograph. It was old and faded, the edges slightly curled from age. The image showed a group of people standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. In the center of the group was a young girl, no older than 7, with a shy smile and wide, curious eyes. It was me. I sat down heavily in the chair, my hands shaking as I studied the photo. How was this possible? I didn't recognize anyone else in the picture, and the house was unfamiliar. But there I was, clear as day, staring back at myself through time. As I turned the photograph over, I saw more writing on the back. "Ask her about that summer. Her My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of it. Who was I supposed to ask? My mother? My grandmother? Memories of long-forgotten summers flooded back, but none of them seemed significant. Yet the note was clear. Someone knew something I didn't. I slipped the photo and note back into the envelope, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. The past I thought I understood was about to change forever. The photograph stayed in my pocket for the next few days, its weight a constant reminder of the unanswered questions it carried. Who were the people in the picture? What was the house? And most pressing of all, who was her, and what did she know about that summer? I decided to start with the most logical person, my mother. She had always been the keeper of our family stories, with an uncanny memory for details that others had long forgotten. But when I called her, I hesitated. How was I supposed to explain the photograph without sounding completely unhinged? "Hi, Mom," I began, trying to keep my voice casual. "Quick question. Do you remember anything unusual about a summer from when I was a kid? Maybe when I was about 7? There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Unusual," she echoed. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Like, did we go anywhere different? Meet anyone new?" "Well," she said slowly, "you spent that summer with your grandmother. Don't you remember?" My heart skipped a beat. My grandmother. I hadn't even thought to connect her to the note. "Not really," I admitted. "What was the reason for that?" "You'd been asking to visit her for ages, so we thought it would be nice for you to spend a few weeks with her," she explained. "It wasn't unusual, though. Just you, her, and that big old house she loved so much." The house. Could it have been the one in the photograph? I swallowed hard, feeling the pieces begin to shift into place. "Do you think Grandma would remember more about that summer?" "Maybe," my mom replied. "She always loved talking about those days. You should call her." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. My grandmother and I hadn't spoken in years, not out of animosity, but because life had a way of drifting us apart. The idea of calling her out of the blue felt strange, but I knew I didn't have a choice. She was the only lead I had. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the photograph in front of me, staring at the number I had just dialed. My grandmother picked up after the third ring, her voice warm and familiar despite the years. "Hello." "Hi, Grandma," I said, my voice catching slightly. "It's me, Sarah." "Sarah," she exclaimed, a mixture of surprise and joy. "It's been so long. How are you, sweetheart?" "I'm good," I said, though my voice betrayed my nerves. I actually wanted to ask you something about the summer I stayed with you when I was 7. Do you remember that?" There was a pause, and I could hear her shifting on the other end of the line. "Of course I remember," she said. "You were such a curious little thing, always asking questions and running around that big old house like you owned it. Do you remember anything unusual about that summer?" I asked, glancing at the photograph again. "Anything I might not have been told?" Another pause. This one felt heavier, as though she were weighing her words. "Why are you asking about this now, Sarah?" she asked gently. I hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "I found a photograph," I said finally. "It's of me standing in front of a house I don't recognize. There are other people in the picture, but I don't know who they are." For a long moment my grandmother didn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost cautious. "That house is mine," she said. "And the people? Well, they're part of a story I wasn't sure you were ready to hear." My heart raced. "I'm ready now, Grandma," I said firmly. "Please. I need to know." She sighed, the sound tinged with both relief and resignation. "All right," she said. "But it's not an easy story to tell. That summer, something happened that changed everything for our family." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What happened?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "It's better if I tell you in person," she said. "Come visit me this weekend. There are some things I need to show you." That weekend I made the drive to my grandmother's house. A long, winding journey that felt heavier with each passing mile. I hadn't been there since I was a child, but as the house came into view, I recognized it immediately. It was the same one from the photograph, down to the ivy crawling up the brick walls and the chipped paint on the front door. My grandmother was waiting on the porch, her familiar smile easing some of my nerves. "It's been too long, Sarah," she said as she pulled me into a hug. "It really has," I agreed, though my mind was racing with questions. "Thank you for letting me come." She waved her hand dismissively. Oh, nonsense. I've been meaning to see you anyway. Now come inside. There's much to talk about. The house smelled the same as I remembered, a mix of aged wood and lavender with a faint hint of something baking in the kitchen. But as comforting as it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that this place held secrets I wasn't prepared for. We settled into the cozy living room, where a fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace. My grandmother reached for an old leather-bound album resting on the coffee table. I've kept this for years, she said, her voice tinged with emotion. It's time you saw it. She opened the album to a page filled with photographs, each one more unsettling than the last. The people in them looked happy, smiling faces, arms draped around one another, but something about their expressions felt off, forced maybe, or like they were hiding something. That summer, she began, pointing to a photo of herself as a young woman, we had visitors. They weren't family, but they stayed with us for weeks. Your parents thought it was an ordinary visit, but it wasn't. These people, she tapped the photo, her face darkening, were running from something. Running? I repeated, leaning closer. From what? Her gaze met mine, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. From a man, she said. He came looking for them one night. And he wasn't the kind of man you wanted to cross. My stomach dropped at her words. What kind of man? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She closed the album and folded her hands in her lap, her expression distant. I didn't know much about him, she admitted. He showed up late one night just after the visitors had left. He was tall, with piercing eyes, and he had this way of speaking that made you feel like he already knew the answers to the questions he was asking. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. What did he want? He was looking for them, she said. The family that had stayed with us. He said they had something that belonged to him and that they couldn't run forever. He didn't tell me what it was, but the way he spoke. I knew he wasn't someone to argue with. I shivered, the weight of her story sinking in. Did you tell him where they went? She shook her head. No. I told him I didn't know, which was the truth. They didn't tell me much about why they were here or where they were going next. All I knew was that they seemed scared. Desperate. For a moment the room was silent except for the crackling of the fire. I tried to process everything she had said, but it only left me with more questions. Why was I here that summer? Asked finally. Was it because of them? He hesitated, then nodded. Your parents thought it would be a good idea for you to get out of the city for a while. They didn't know about the visitors or the man who came after them. I never told them. Her words sent a chill down my spine. All these years I had thought that summer was just a normal part of my childhood. But now it felt like I had been caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. Grandma, I said softly, my voice trembling, why do you think this is coming up now? After all this time? She looked at me, her expression unreadable. Because I think whoever sent you that photograph wants you to finish what was started. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. Finish what was started? I repeated, barely able to process what she was suggesting. What does that even mean? I don't know anything about these people or what happened to them. My grandmother leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. I don't know either, she admitted. But someone clearly thinks you're the key to uncovering the truth. That photograph wasn't sent to me or your mother. It was sent to you. I stared at the photo still clutched in my hand, the faces of strangers who now felt impossibly connected to me. What if it's a mistake? Asked, my voice small. What if this was meant for someone else? She shook her head firmly. It's not a mistake, Sarah. You were there. You might not remember everything, but you were a part of it, even if you didn't realize it at the time. The room felt suddenly suffocating, the crackling fire too warm against my skin. I stood abruptly, pacing the length of the living room. I don't understand any of this, I said, my voice rising. How am I supposed to find answers about something that happened when I was 7? You start by asking questions, she said calmly. And by trusting that the answers will come, even if they don't make sense right away. Her certainty frustrated me. How could she be so composed when I felt like my entire world had been upended? But beneath my frustration was a growing determination. I couldn't just walk away from this. Not now, not with so many pieces of the puzzle left unanswered. Do you have anything else from that summer? Asked finally. Anything that might help me figure out who these people were? She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. There's a trunk in the attic, she said. I haven't opened it in years, but it might have something useful. Without another word, I headed for the stairs, my heart pounding as I climbed toward the attic. Dust motes floated in the dim light as I pushed open the creaky door, revealing a space cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten memories. In the corner, beneath a faded quilt, was the trunk my grandmother had mentioned. I knelt beside it, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside were remnants of a time I barely remembered. Photo albums, letters, even a few of my childhood toys. But what caught my eye was a small leather-bound journal resting on top of a pile of papers. The initials M were embossed on the cover, and as I flipped it open, my breath caught. The handwriting wasn't my grandmother's, nor was it my parents'. It belonged to someone else. One of the visitors, perhaps. The first page read, "We can't run forever. I hope this will be enough to protect her." Her. Who was her, and why did she need protection? My pulse quickened as I turned the pages, the entries detailing a life on the run, filled with cryptic references to danger and betrayal. Whoever had written this had been desperate, their fear practically leaping off the page. And then, on the final entry, I found something that made my blood run cold. My name. I stared at the journal, my hands trembling as I traced my name on the page. The entry was brief but haunting. "Sarah must never know the truth, not until it's safe. If you find this, it means I failed to protect her. Please, whoever reads this, help her understand." My breath caught, the weight of the words pressing down on me like a physical force. The writer had known me, had been trying to protect me from something I couldn't even remember. But what? And why was it so dangerous that they thought it was safer for me to stay in the dark? I flipped back through the journal, searching for anything that might offer more clarity. The entries were fragmented, filled with hurried writing and references to people and places I didn't recognize. One name appeared repeatedly, Elias. Whoever Elias was, he seemed to be at the center of everything. The writer described him as persistent and ruthless, someone who wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. A chill ran through me. Could Elias be the man my grandmother had mentioned? The one who came looking for the visitors that summer? So, what did he want, and how was I connected to it all? I tucked the journal under my arm and descended the attic stairs, my mind racing. My grandmother was waiting in the living room, her expression tense as she saw the look on my face. "What did you find?" she asked. I handed her the journal, watching as her eyes widened while she skimmed the pages. When she reached the final entry, she looked up at me, her face pale. "I don't know what this means," she said softly. "But whoever wrote this clearly cared about you. They were trying to keep you safe. But from what?" I demanded, the frustration boiling over. "None of this makes sense. Why would someone go to such lengths to protect me, and why is this all coming up now?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But maybe it's time to stop running from the questions. Whoever sent that photograph wanted you to remember. Maybe they think you're ready to face the truth now." Her words settled heavily in my chest. The truth. The idea both terrified and intrigued me. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Too many pieces were still missing, and I was determined to find them. That night I couldn't sleep. The journal sat on the nightstand beside me, its presence almost too heavy to ignore. I found myself replaying every detail my grandmother had shared, every cryptic note and photograph that had led me here. The name Elias echoed in my mind like a warning bell, and the thought of being connected to someone so dangerous made my skin crawl. By dawn I made up my mind. If I was going to uncover the truth, I couldn't do it alone. I needed help, someone who could look at this with fresh eyes and maybe see something I was missing. After some hesitation, I called Emily. When I explained everything, she was silent for a long moment. "Sarah," she finally said, her voice cautious, "this is a lot. Are you sure you're okay?" "Not really," I admitted. "But I need answers, and I don't know where else to start." "Okay," she said, her tone softening. "Bring everything over. We'll figure this out together." An hour later, I was sitting in Emily's apartment, the journal and photographs spread out on her coffee table. She studied them with the same mix of intrigue and disbelief I'd felt. "So this Elias guy," she said, flipping through the journal. "Who do you think he is?" "I have no idea," I said. "But whoever he is, he was important enough to be mentioned over and over." Emily frowned, tapping the page. "There's a pattern here. Look, he's always mentioned alongside certain locations. It's like the writer was tracking his movements." I leaned over, my heart quickening as I saw what she meant. The journal entries referenced several cities and dates, most of which didn't mean anything to me. But one stood out: the name of the city I was in now, listed alongside the date of that summer. They were here, I whispered. Elias and the others. They were here the summer I stayed with my grandmother. Emily nodded, her brow furrowed. And if they were here, maybe someone else remembers. Someone who might know what really happened. Her suggestion sent a spark of hope through me. You mean like records? Newspaper archives? Exactly, she said. If Elias was as dangerous as this journal makes him sound, there has to be some trace of him. The idea was daunting, but it was the first solid lead I'd had since this whole thing began. Let's do it, I said, my determination outweighing my fear. Let's find him. The next morning, Emily and I made our way to the local library, which housed an extensive archive of newspapers and public records. The building was quiet, the air thick with the scent of old paper and wood polish. We split up, each taking a section of the archives to comb through, searching for any mention of Elias or the family from the photograph. Hours passed with little progress. The microfilm machine whirred softly as I scrolled through article after article, my eyes glazing over from the sheer volume of information. Most of what I found was mundane: local events, property sales, minor crimes. But then, buried in an issue from the summer I stayed with my grandmother, I found something. The headline read, "Local family disappears under mysterious circumstances." My breath caught as I scanned the article. It detailed the sudden disappearance of a family of 4 who had been staying in a rental property near the edge of town. Neighbors reported strange activity in the days leading up to their disappearance, including late-night visitors and the sound of raised voices. The family was last seen on a Friday evening, and by the following morning the house was empty. My pulse quickened as I read on. The article mentioned that the family had been renting the house under an assumed name and that police suspected they were hiding from someone. One witness claimed to have seen a man lurking near the property the night before the family vanished. His description was vague but chilling: tall, dark coat, piercing eyes. It had to be Elias. I called Emily over, showing her the article with shaking hands. "This is it," I said, my voice trembling. "This has to be about them." She read the article quickly, her expression growing more serious with each line. "It fits," she said. "The timeline, the location, everything. But what happened to them? And why does this connect to you?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But if Elias was involved, maybe he was looking for something they had. Something he didn't find." Emily's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "What if that something wasn't an object?" she said. "What if it was a person?" The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind flashed back to the journal entry. "I hope this will be enough to protect her." "Me," I whispered, the realization sinking in. They were trying to protect me. The realization that the family in the photograph, and perhaps even the mysterious stranger Elias, were connected to me was overwhelming. My chest felt tight as I sat back in the library chair, staring blankly at the article. All this time I thought I was chasing a mystery. Now I realized the mystery was chasing me. Emily leaned forward, her voice steady and calm. "Hey Sarah," she said. "If this family was protecting you, then there has to be a reason. Something about you or your family ties into this. We just need to figure out what." I nodded, though my thoughts were spiraling. The journal, the photograph, the cryptic notes. Each was a piece of a puzzle I was just beginning to understand. The journal said something about Elias not stopping until he gets what he wants, I said slowly. But what could he have wanted from them? From me? Emily frowned, tapping her fingers on the table. "Maybe it's time to look closer at your family," she suggested. "Your grandmother already gave you some clues, but what about your parents? Is there anything about their past that could be connected to this?" My parents. The thought made my stomach churn. I loved them, but we weren't exactly close. They were private people, always careful with their words, especially about anything emotional or personal. Could they have been hiding something this big? I hesitated, then pulled out my phone. It took me 3 tries to dial my dad's number, my fingers trembling slightly. He answered on the second ring, his voice brisk and familiar. "Sarah? Everything okay?" "Hi, Dad," I said, trying to steady my voice. I need to ask you something about when I was a kid. About the summer I stayed with Grandma." There was a long pause. "Why are you asking about that now?" he said finally, his tone cautious. "Because I think there's something I wasn't told," I said, glancing at Emily for reassurance. Something about a family that was staying with Grandma. And a man named Elias. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When my dad finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. Sarah, where did you hear that name? Hearing my dad say Elias's name sent a shiver down my spine. I found a journal, I said carefully. It mentioned him. And a family that disappeared. Dad, what's going on? For a moment, it sounded like he was about to speak, but then he sighed heavily. Sarah, I need you to understand something, he said finally. We didn't tell you about that summer because we thought it was over. We thought you were safe. Safe from what? I pressed, my voice rising. What were you keeping from me? There was a man, my dad said reluctantly. Elias. He was dangerous, Sarah. He was after the family staying with your grandmother because he thought they had something that belonged to him. When they left, we thought he'd move on, but then, he started asking questions about you. My stomach churned. Me? Why me? We don't know, he admitted. But your grandmother insisted we send you to stay with her that summer, saying it would be safer. When Elias showed up at her house, she told him the family had left and that you were just a visitor. It worked, he didn't bother you again after that. But why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, my voice breaking. Why would you keep this from me? We thought we were protecting you, he said. And honestly, we thought it was over. That family disappeared and we never heard from Elias again. We wanted you to have a normal life. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. But it's not over, Dad. Someone sent me a photograph of that summer. Someone wants me to know the truth. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, my dad spoke, his voice heavy with regret. Then it sounds like you've been pulled into something bigger than we realized, he said. But Sarah, whatever you do, be careful. If Elias is still out there, you don't want him knowing you're involved. The call ended, leaving me with more questions than answers. I turned to Emily, my mind racing. They knew, I said, my voice trembling. They knew I was connected to this and never told me. Emily reached across the table, placing a hand on mine. You're connected, but you're also stronger now than you were then, she said firmly. And if someone sent you that photograph, maybe it's because they think you're ready to handle it. Her words steadied me, even as the weight of what I had learned pressed down on me. I didn't have all the pieces yet, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stop now. Someone out there knew the truth about Elias, the family, and why I was tied to it all. And I was going to find them, no matter what it took. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of determination. My father's warning about Elias lingered in the back of my mind, but it only made me more certain that I needed to uncover the truth. If Elias was still out there, and if someone believed I was the key to finishing what had been started, I couldn't let fear stop me. Emily and I decided to dig deeper into the journal. There were names scattered throughout, people the writer mentioned briefly as though they had been part of a larger network. One name stood out, Catherine. Unlike the other mentions, Catherine appeared multiple times, often alongside entries about safety or protection. Catherine has the documents now. We're trusting her with everything. Catherine says it's too risky to stay. She's making arrangements. Without Catherine, we wouldn't have made it this far. Who is Catherine? Emily asked, leaning over the journal. She sounds important. She has to be, I agreed. If the writer trusted her with something so vital, maybe she knows more about what happened to the family. We searched online, combing through directories and old records, hoping to find any clue about a Catherine who might have been connected to my grandmother or the city at the time. It took hours, but eventually we found a lead. A Catherine Delaney listed as the director of a local historical society back in the 1990s. Her name appeared in articles about community preservation and genealogy projects, but more intriguingly, her address at the time was only a few blocks from my grandmother's house. Do you think she's still around? Emily asked, her voice filled with cautious optimism. There's only one way to find out, I said, jotting down the address. If she's still there, she might be able to fill in the gaps. We drove to the address that afternoon, my nerves fraying as we approached the house. It was a modest two-story home with a tidy front yard and a porch lined with potted plants. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment there was no response and I thought the house might be empty. But then the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 70s with piercing gray eyes and a posture that exuded both strength and warmth. Can I help you? She asked, her voice steady but wary. Are you Catherine Delaney? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Her eyes narrowed. I am. And you are? I hesitated, then held up the photograph. My name is Sarah, I said. I think you might know something about this. Her gaze shifted to the photograph and her expression changed instantly. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by something I couldn't quite place. Fear perhaps, or sadness. You'd better come in, she said quietly, stepping aside to let us enter. Catherine led us into a cozy living room filled with bookshelves, family photos, and the faint scent of lavender. The atmosphere was warm, but her guarded expression told me this conversation wouldn't be easy. She gestured to the couch. Have a seat, she said, settling into an armchair across from us. Her sharp eyes flicked between me and Emily before resting on the photograph in my hand. Where did you find that? It was sent to me, I explained, setting the photo on the coffee table. I think it's connected to a family that stayed with my grandmother the summer I was 7. I've been trying to piece together what happened to them. Catherine leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. That family, they were running from a man named Elias, weren't they? Yes, I said, surprised by how quickly she understood. Do you know who they were? Or why Elias was after them? She nodded slowly. I knew them, she said. They were good people caught in something far bigger than they ever expected. Elias was after them because they had proof, documents that could expose him and the organization he worked for. My pulse quickened. What kind of organization? She sighed. I don't know all the details, but from what they told me it was powerful and dangerous. They stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see and they paid the price for it. What happened to them? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They disappeared, Catherine said, her tone heavy with regret. I helped them as much as I could, finding safe places for them to stay, connecting them with people who could protect them. But Elias always seemed to be one step ahead. The last time I saw them was the night they left your grandmother's house. After that, nothing. I leaned back, trying to absorb everything she had said. But why am I connected to this? I asked. Why would someone send me that photograph now after all this time? Catherine's gaze softened. Because you were there, Sarah, she said. Even if you don't remember it, you were part of their story. And maybe someone believes you're the key to finishing what they started. I shook my head, frustration bubbling to the surface. But I don't know anything. How am I supposed to help when I don't even understand what's going on? Catherine reached across the table, placing a hand on mine. You know more than you think, she said gently. And sometimes the answers come when you stop trying to force them. Her words were meant to reassure me, but they only deepened the weight of my uncertainty. I glanced at Emily, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. We'll figure this out, she said. One step at a time. Catherine stood, disappearing into another room for a moment before returning with a small, weathered box. This belonged to the family, she said, setting it on the table. They left it with me for safekeeping, but I never opened it. Maybe it holds the answers you're looking for. My hands trembled as I reached for the box, the worn edges rough under my fingers. Whatever was inside, I knew it would change everything. The small box sat between us, its presence almost too heavy to bear. Catherine watched me closely, her expression a mix of encouragement and caution. Emily sat silently beside me, her steady presence grounding me as I took a deep breath and opened the lid. Inside was a collection of items that seemed ordinary at first glance. Faded photographs, a bundle of letters tied with twine, and a small brass key. But as I carefully sifted through the contents, the gravity of what I was holding began to sink in. Each piece felt like a fragment of a larger truth, waiting to be uncovered. The letters were the first thing I examined. They were written in the same handwriting as the journal, their tone urgent and filled with references to hiding, running, and staying ahead of Elias. One line stood out. We've done everything we can to protect Sarah, but if Elias finds us, all of it will be for nothing. I froze, the words echoing in my mind. They were protecting me, I whispered, my voice trembling. Why? Why would they go to such lengths for someone who wasn't even their family? Catherine leaned forward, her expression grave. Because they believed you were important, she said. I don't know all the details, but they were convinced that keeping you safe was the key to stopping Elias. The weight of her words settled heavily in my chest. For years, I had lived an ordinary life, unaware of the forces that had been at play in the background. Now I was being asked to confront a legacy I didn't even know I had. Next, I turned my attention to the photographs. Most of them were candid shots of the family. The parents smiling nervously, the children playing in a field, their laughter frozen in time. But one photo stood out. It was a group picture taken in front of a nondescript building, and in the corner, almost hidden, was a man. His face was partially obscured, but his presence was unmistakable. "It's him," I said, holding up the photo. "Elias." Emily leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "Do you think this building is still around? It might be a clue." Catherine nodded. "It's possible. That photo was taken here in the city, not far from your grandmother's house." The final item in the box was the small brass key. It had no label, no obvious purpose, but its weight in my hand felt significant. "What do you think this opens?" I asked. Catherine shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "But if the family left it here, it must be important." Emily studied the key, her brow furrowed. "Maybe it's for something in that building," she suggested. "If it's still standing, we might find answers there." Armed with the photograph and the brass key, Emily and I left Catherine's house, our next destination clear. The building in the photograph wasn't far, but the weight of what we might uncover made every step feel heavier. Catherine's parting words echoed in my mind. "Be careful, Sarah. Whatever you find, make sure it's worth the risk." The building turned out to be an old warehouse, its faded brick walls overgrown with ivy and its windows darkened with grime. It looked abandoned, but there was a distinct air of importance about it, as though its secrets had been waiting patiently for someone to uncover them. We approached the entrance cautiously, the brass key clutched tightly in my hand. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, its surface rusted from years of exposure. My heart raced as I slid the key into the lock. To my surprise, it turned smoothly, the mechanism clicking open with an eerie finality. Emily shot me a nervous glance. "Are you sure about this?" "No," I admitted, pushing the door open. "But I don't think we have a choice." Inside, the warehouse was vast and silent, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Rows of shelves stretched into the shadows, filled with old crates and boxes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. At first glance, it seemed like a dead end, but then I spotted something out of place. In the center of the room was a table, its surface bare except for a single, sealed envelope. My name was written on it in the same handwriting that had guided me through this entire journey. My hands shook as I picked it up, the envelope feeling heavier than it should have. "What does it say?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I opened it carefully, unfolding the note inside. The message was brief but chilling. "You've come this far. Now you have to decide, will you keep running or will you finally face the truth?" Beneath the note was another key, this one smaller and more ornate than the first. A faint etching on the bow of the key caught my attention. 218. Emily leaned over my shoulder. "A room number?" she suggested. "It has to be," I said, my mind racing. "But where?" We searched the warehouse for more clues, our footsteps echoing loudly in the empty space. Eventually, we found an old map pinned to the wall near the back of the room. It detailed the layout of the building and the surrounding area, but one location was circled in red ink, a nearby hotel. "That has to be it," Emily said, her excitement barely masking her nerves. "Room 218. I nodded, tucking the key and the note into my pocket. The pieces were coming together, but the closer we got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. Still, I knew there was no turning back. The answers I had been seeking were within reach, and I was ready to face whatever waited for me in that room. The drive to the hotel was tense, the air in the car heavy with unspoken fears. Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds as though expecting someone to be following us. I clutched the ornate key in my lap, its cold weight a reminder of the unknown waiting ahead. The hotel wasn't what I expected. It was an old, unassuming building tucked into a quiet street, its faded sign barely visible in the evening light. The lobby was empty except for a disinterested clerk behind the front desk, who barely glanced up as we entered. Room 218 was on the second floor at the end of a dimly lit hallway. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, the silence around us amplifying my racing heartbeat. When we reached the door, I hesitated, staring at the tarnished brass numbers. "You don't have to do this alone," Emily said, her voice steady but soft. I nodded, grateful for her presence, and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click, the door creaking open to reveal a small, sparsely furnished room. At first glance it looked ordinary, just a bed, a dresser and a chair by the window. But on the desk sat a small metal box, its surface scratched and worn as though it had been handled many times. I approached the box cautiously, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside were a stack of papers, a small tape recorder and an envelope labeled for Sarah. My breath caught in my throat as I opened the envelope, pulling out a letter written in the same handwriting that had guided me here. Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you've found the truth, or at least the beginning of it. The family who protected you all those years ago didn't do it out of obligation. They did it because you hold the key to exposing everything Elias and his organization have done. These documents will prove it. But be warned, the truth comes at a cost. Once you open this door, there's no turning back. I set the letter down, my hands shaking. The stack of papers in the box appeared to be detailed records, transactions, meeting minutes, names. It was a damning trail that painted a vivid picture of corruption, conspiracy, and unimaginable danger. Emily leaned over my shoulder, her eyes wide. This is huge, she whispered. Sarah, this could change everything. I nodded, my mind spinning. The evidence in this box wasn't just a link to my past. It was a weapon, one that could finally bring Elias and his organization to justice. But the letter's warning lingered in my mind. The truth comes at a cost. What do we do now? Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. I stared at the papers, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. We don't run, I said finally, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. We face it. Together. Emily and I left the hotel with the box of documents carefully tucked into my bag, the weight of its contents heavier than anything I'd ever carried. The streets outside felt colder, darker, as though the world itself had shifted under the weight of what we now knew. Every step we took felt like it was being watched, every shadow a potential threat. Back at Emily's apartment, we laid everything out on the kitchen table. The letters, the photographs, the journal, and now the damning evidence from the box. The scope of what we were looking at was staggering. The documents detailed a network of corruption that reached far beyond anything I could have imagined. Politicians, corporations, even law enforcement. Elias's organization had woven itself into the very fabric of society. This is insane, Emily said, running her fingers through her hair. If this gets out, it could take them all down. But that's exactly why it's dangerous, I said, my voice trembling. If Elias finds out we have this, he won't stop until he silences us. Emily nodded grimly. Then we need to act fast. We can't sit on this. We spent hours poring over the documents, trying to make sense of the web of connections and figuring out the best way to expose the truth. It was overwhelming, but for the first time I felt like I understood why the family in the photograph had risked everything. They had seen the cost of silence, and now I was being asked to carry their fight forward. As dawn broke, we made a plan. The first step was to contact a trusted journalist, someone who could verify the documents and ensure they reached the right people. It was a dangerous move, but we knew we couldn't do this alone. The weight of the truth was too much for one person to carry. Before we made the call, I took one last look at the photograph. The faces of the family stared back at me, their expressions filled with a mixture of hope and determination. Thank you, I whispered, my voice catching. For everything. Emily placed a hand on my shoulder. They'd be proud of you, she said softly. I nodded, taking a deep breath as I dialed the journalist's number. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Hello. This is Sarah, I said, my voice steady despite the fear simmering beneath the surface. I have something you need to see. But we have to meet in person. It's too dangerous to explain over the phone. The journalist agreed to meet later that day, and as I hung up, I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I wasn't running anymore. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.